Așadar să intrăm în direct cu acest invitat și să îi urăm bun venit. Welcome, Mr. Rosenbaum.
How are you?
Hello.
Do you hear me?
Yes, we hear you. Hello. You are live.
Good morning.
Good morning.
And I take it we'll be beginning in a couple of minutes. Hello?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, I do.
Oh, so we are online. It's your time. Please join us.
Okay. So would you like me to speak for 10 or 15 minutes? Is that the plan?
We have enough time. You can choose all the subject that you consider right for this panel. Yes.
Is Marius Porfiro joining us?
For the moment, no. We wait his intervention. For the moment, he's not online, but in few minutes he will join us.
Okay, but you want me to begin talking now?
Yes, of course. If you prefer, yeah.
Sure. Okay. Well, I've been asked to speak about the issue of building the post-pandemic world and critical issues for public sector governance. And these are unquestionably very, very complex and significant issues. Certainly, the pandemic has been hard on all of us. It's been particularly hard on those least advantaged and those with the least resources, but it has been hard on everybody. Middle-class people, less obviously on the well-to-do, just in part because they have the economic well-being to protect themselves more easily. But one consequence of this has been of the kind of pressure that all of us have faced and the kind of anxieties that all of us have faced is the reality that people are very concerned about their future. They're concerned about their future in terms of basic things like getting children back to school, even more basic things, their own jobs, their own economic well-being. Not only are there the issues that result in terms of public individual concerns, but there are complex issues for our societies as well. There is the supply chain issues that are being increasingly talked about, the inability of goods and products to be produced because of the difficulties in terms of moving goods around the world, and the fact that situations of doing that have been made much more complicated. When you combine all of this, the individual concerns, the concerns of health, the concerns of economic well-being, we see that it is producing a very destabilizing set of environmental concerns within which those of us who are concerned with public sector governance must work. We see this in lots of different ways. We see that in the rise of authoritarian strongmen in many countries, the attractiveness of populist strong men, strong authoritarian type leadership in many countries, certainly in countries like Poland, Hungary, Turkey, extreme cases in countries like China and Russia, in my own country, where we have probably reached a point in which our democratic institutions are under more challenge since our Civil War of the 1860s, when 600,000 Americans lost their lives fighting one another over basic issues of public governance. And again, if I can focus on my own country rather than other countries, but I think this data would be fairly similar in many countries. If you ask Democrats, our two major parties, Democratic Party and the Republican Party, if you ask Democrats if they trust Republicans when they're in power, 40% of Democrats say they do not trust Republicans when they're in power. The same is true for the Republican electoral base. 40% of their members say they would not trust Democrats to govern the country in behalf of all of the people. Not surprisingly, a large portion of those Democrats and Republicans who express distrust in the other side are also inclined to agree with the poll question that if it's necessary, it may, one may need to resort to violence to prevent the other party's adherents from destroying the country. That is, in many respects, very concerning, very, very concerning, that large portions, typically 30% of the party members of each party, would be willing to accept violence as a way of achieving their political goals. That very fearsome data, very concerning data about the inclination of such a substantial portion of our population, of the population of each of the two parties, to be willing to consider the resort to violence, comes in part as a consequence of general decline of public confidence in governance and in effective governance over the course of the past 4 to 5 decades. If you go back, again, I like to focus on my own country, but I think you might find very similar data for many, many countries. If you go back to the 1950s, about 70% of all Americans would agree with the statement that they totally trust government to do the right thing to advance the interests of all of the people of the society. Today, that figure hovers around 20 to 17%, depending on which survey you look at. The reality is there has been a substantial decline. And this, if you want to, my topic being critical issues for public sector governance, no issue is more concerning than the decline of trust and confidence in the public sector's ability to deal with the problems that our citizens are facing, problems that, as I was saying at the outset, are exacerbated by the past year, 2 years of concerns and lockdowns and deaths and illnesses. So we find ourselves in a very, very great situation of very, very great difficulties. There's an well, it's understandable in one sense that we have reached this point. I mean, if you look at the history of public governance, not just in my country, but indeed around the world, the past 40 years have been very difficult ones in which governance and the public sector generally have been under great deal of criticism and great deal of attack. This begins obviously with Margaret Thatcher in Great Britain, Ronald Reagan in the United States, obviously two of the, well, arguably the two most prominent governmental political figures of the 1980s. Really begin this broad, wide-ranging attack on government. And the result of this is the kind of data that we see today, in which large portions of our societies lack confidence in the ability of government to get things done and get things done effectively. Ironically, at least for my country, the realities are that the data and the historic patterns are very, very clear in terms of the absolute critical importance of good governance and effective governance in terms of the development of our societies. I mean, if you look, taking my country as a kind of interesting natural experiment in what is the impact of effective and robust government on a society. It's very interesting to just look, even briefly, at the past 80 or so years of experience, actually the past 100 years of experience in my country in terms of the role of the public sector in terms of shaping economic well-being for the society. Looking at, say, the last 100 years, you find a period, the 1920s, in which there was great growth in inequality, arguably the most significant period of inequality since the Industrial Revolution had begun. That obviously leads to, and this is also a time in which there's very, very limited involvement of government in terms of trying to regulate and develop a robust public sector with active government regulation of the private sector and active government collaboration with the private sector in terms of economic development and economic well-being types of issues. The 1930s see the collapse of the world's economy and see a dramatic change. And my country really represents, I think, really the classic case study of this. From the 1930s to the 1970s, we see the most robust government involvement in our economy, in our economic affairs. We see the most activist government in terms of initiating important programs and policies. We see the most expensive government up to that point in the sense of taxation, high rates of taxation, high rates of government regulation. As I was commenting a second ago, this begins to change dramatically at the end of the 1970s and the beginning of the 1980s, where political figures like Margaret Thatcher, like conservative forces, conservative political parties in many of the Westminster countries, also in many of the Western democracies, begin to gain more and more political power. And they begin to talk about deregulation, cutting tax rates, and the like. And we have been living through that in my country and other countries for the past 4 decades. Well, what does it look like in terms of economic productivity and fairness in distribution of the income? Well, if you look at the data, the most dynamic, the most significant growth in the American economy is the period from the 1930s to the 1970s. It also is the period in which there is the most significant decline in inequality in resources, not just in the United States, but indeed all over the world. If you look at data from France, the United Kingdom, the United States in 1910, the top 1% of the population controlled 50% of all the wealth. Think of that, 1% of the people controlling 50% of the wealth. And this is a worldwide phenomenon. By the 1970s, that figure had declined to 20% from 50. The top 1%, as a result of government activities, as a result of the partnership that had been created between government and the public sector. In that period from 1910 to 1970, there had been such a degree of fairness in society and such a degree of economic growth that our wealth and income were much more fairly distributed across the societies, across our societies. Since the 1970s, that has begun to reverse, and in some cases reverse very, very significantly. In my own country, in the period from 1970s to today, the top 1% of the population has increased their share of the national wealth from 20% to almost 40%, literally doubling the amount of wealth that they control. And what has characterized this, what has facilitated this, is in fact the withdrawal of government from its role as a balancing force in our societies. We have gone from a period, the 1930s to the 1970s, of extensive government engagement in terms of issues of social equity, in terms of increasing fairness, in terms of engaging with the private sector to produce a productive period of dynamic economic growth. From the 1970s since, we have been in an era, not just in my country, but in many countries around the world, in which government has been withdrawing, in which government's shares of revenue has been declining significantly. And we see this in terms of the fact that there is dramatic decline, for example, in the degree of resources that governments possess vis-a-vis the private sector. If you look at Western democracies in the late 1970s, 30% of the resources of the society were represented by government investments in economic productivity and social well-being, etc. Today, the governmental share of the broader society of societal wealth around the world has declined from 30% to 10%. So we have seen this dramatic pulling back, this dramatic lessening of government engagement with society and the public sector, with the absolute result of it being the growth of inequality, dramatic growth of inequality that really limits the access of people to resources. We live in a world today in which the top 20% of the population possess 90% of the automobiles in the world. The bottom 1%, bottom 20% of the population possess barely more than 1% of the world's automobiles. What does that do in our societies in terms of it dramatically, obviously limits the capacity of those who are most disadvantaged in all sorts of ways, whether it is getting your sick child or mother or father to the hospital in the face of COVID, or whether it is getting yourself to your new job, hopefully if you get a job in the aftermath of COVID. It dramatically limits the capacity of people. And what does this in turn do as we see these growing inequalities? We find ourselves in situations in which people's confidence in their society generally and in their government's ability to meet their basic needs declines significantly in the way I talked about earlier, as represented in my own country, but represented in so many countries around the world. We are living, for the first time in 20 years, Freedom House, a major non-governmental organization that keeps track of democratic development around the world. For the first time in 20 years, Freedom House tells us there are more authoritarian, non-democratic governments in the world than there are democratic. And this is the result of the fact that there has been significant backsliding in terms of democratic governance in many, many parts of the world. And where that backsliding has not resulted in a movement to a much more authoritarian, non-accountable type government, it has shattered the confidence in governments where the backsliding has not been nearly so severe. And obviously, the most notable example is my own country, where we have more serious doubts that have risen about the effectiveness of our governmental institutions, about the fairness of our governmental institutions, about the basic beliefs in democracy, arguably than any time, as I said before, since our Civil War that cost 600,000 lives over these issues. Well, what do we need to do about this? Well, it seems to me critical is to begin to make government work more effectively. That's easily said, not nearly so easily done, but it does require increased concerns about accountability, about the accountability of public figures. It requires, on the one hand, that government produce results for the citizens, but on the other hand, that we limit the growing concentration of power that is the byproduct of the rise of inclinations towards authoritarianism. And I think this is not an easy task. It's not a quick task, but it is going to require very, very strong commitment on the part of both our political class and our administrative class. I think one of the problems that our societies have faced is a kind of misguided notion that has grown over the course of the past century, in which public administration, the size of government, the amount of people working to support government, over this past century, there has been the increasing belief that there is a separation between politics and governmental administration, and you have totally nonpartisan governmental administrators. Well, on the one hand, yes, when you are managing government services, dealing with the public, it is very critical that you have a nonpartisan, effective government and governmental services, governmental responses that are available to all of our citizens. But at the same time, the large portion of our citizenry who are involved in government and government management also are among the absolute most knowledgeable people about what government does, how it can do it, and how it can do it most effectively, most expeditiously, and most fairly. And it is critical, I think, for all of us engaged in trying to build the post-pandemic society and governance. It is critical to recognize that as committed as we are to our roles as public administrators and public managers, even more importantly, we are first citizens, and citizens of hopefully increasingly democratic regimes, increasingly responsive governments that share and that provide the kind of basic support, the basic fairness, the basic qualities of life that all of our citizens look for and work for. And I think at that point, I will stop now and say it's really been a great pleasure and a great honor to be asked to share some of these thoughts with you.